Okay, so I also changed my topic a little bit, overcoming the European crisis and prospects for a political union. I think the paper is a little bit long, but I will present only the key elements of this. Let me start with a brief reference to the analysis of the Pew Research Center from Washington. They were looking into 8 EU countries, and not surprisingly, what they found in a sentence is the EU is the sick man of Europe, in the sense that the political support for economic integration has quite reduced. And while Germany is still one of the countries where the majority of the population is in favor of more integration. I think the EU institutions are really under stress in this twin crisis, or the banking crisis and the euro crisis. I think the Commission is really weak. The European Parliament is a very particular institutional animal. It's a kind of a permanent super grand coalition of almost all parties in a game against the Commission, so there's no normal opposition versus government role, and I think this invites to the abnormal growth of anti-EU parties. Normally, if you had the criticism, you would have, I don't know, the Social Democrats or the Conservatives picking up the critics, but this is not the case in this strange setup which we have. And the European Council is the big winner in this crisis, and member states, I think, is also a difficult thing in the sense that EU is still growing, the euro area is growing, and then we have a lot of confusion in the sense that, like with the fiscal compact, this is not within the system of treaties, it's outside. The UK and Czech Republic said initially no. The Czech Republic is now revising its perspective, and also we don't have, I think, a good view of euro bonds. Economists don't agree. And then in the middle of everything, you have the ECB, who is expected to do everything. So what you see here is, I think, what the Commission definitely should not do. As you all will remember, there was this nice regulation initiative for regulating oil carafes in restaurants. This is a picture which I took 2 weeks ago in Warsaw in a restaurant. 3 unregulated oil carafes. I can assure you the quality was okay. So what instead I think is really important, and I have taken here the liberty to suggest a design, what would be a euro bond, what could it look like? Here you have the face of Mr. Delors. I have no idea whether he finds this idea is useful. Some of you will recognize a building in Brussels. And I'm just showing you this because this is really one of the most important issues, and I think that economists so far have not handled this analytical issue properly. I will show you also that in a theoretical approach that the benefits from the euro are actually bigger than usually thought, particularly if you take into account the role of the euro as a reserve currency, and that position, of course, is linked to some extent to the existence of euro bonds. To put it different, can you imagine what the US position in financial markets would be if there would be no federal government bonds? And what I'm showing you in the end of the presentation is a kind of proposal what a minimum European system of states would look like, so a political union. What is strange to some extent, I find, if you take a look at some of the publications, you find, for instance, in the Netherlands by the PVV, which is a right-wing party, they order all kind of studies in London, and obviously in London you can get just everything. I think they pay a lot for it, and so you can find, as I quote in my paper, 2 studies, one showing the advantages of leaving the European Union. So this is the latest paper, what are the benefits for the Netherlands if it leaves the EU. I was used to some serious analysis from colleagues showing what are the benefits of EU membership, and they also had an expert study, of course, on the Netherlands and also some other countries leaving the euro. So they use kind of professional arguments to make their political case. I think the euro crisis clearly has undermined confidence in the EU. There is a lack of professionalism visible, I think, in this Greek deficit fraud and this so-called Irish light regulation fraud, and this is a political fraud. And we have seen this strange shift of power which gives rise to increasing economic nationalism, because the EU summit shows increasingly in TV news Mrs. Merkel and nobody from the Commission actually. What we have is, of course, all these goals. We have a supranational monetary policy. We do not even have, I think, a good policy on the external equilibrium. So, for instance, we in Germany, we have a law which defines what is external equilibrium, which doesn't make any sense. The law is from 1967. And, of course, we should look only at the euro area in terms of external equilibrium. So there is some success, of course, in terms of EU integration. Price stability, I think, is least debated at the moment. Sustainable public finances, yeah, this is 99% the national policy goal. Environmental progress, economic stability, I'm coming back to this later. So a little bit on a theoretical perspective, in this case, a neoclassical growth model with international signature is very simple and straightforward. So I'm starting with a production function. We have capital K, knowledge A, and labor L in a Cobb-Douglas production function. Knowledge grows at an exogenous rate A, and labor grows at an exogenous rate N. And of course, there's a country 2 which holds reserves R star. So this is China, which holds, in this case, euro. And we assume there's a difference between the net marginal product of capital and the yield R prime on reserves. So if you take a look at Barry Eichengreen's book on the role of the US dollar, the book says that in the case of the US, you should assume that the difference is roughly 2 to 3 percentage points. So I assume here that the difference is constant, namely it's omega, and I can state a good market equilibrium condition, which then reads that the gross investment, in this case net investment plus depreciation delta times K, is equal to the savings, and then there is this additional term. So the additional term is this gap omega. So we are paying a lower interest rate to the Chinese central bank for their holding of euro reserves. And you multiply this, of course, with the stock of reserves, which is expressed here in real units of country 1, so of the euro area. And I am assuming that this R star relative to P is a policy, or can be expressed through a policy parameter, so that the Chinese government wants to have a certain amount available for imports, so it's proportionate, and the parameter therefore is phi to the euro area GDP. And to cut a long story short, what you then get is a result for the steady state solution, so for the capital intensity, so K relative to labor and efficiency units, and also most important then equation 8, because we're interested in per capita income small y, and then you have in the numerator the savings rate, and then this red expression, which is omega times this desired reserve ratio, which the Chinese central bank has. And of course, the result is, not surprisingly, that the level of the growth path is higher. And you probably will all remember that the market share of the euro in 1999, when the monetary union started, was roughly 15%. It increased to a little bit more than 25% before the crisis. Is now down to probably 23%. And of course, I think it could increase furthermore if we would introduce euro bonds and solve our basic problems. Okay, in the paper I'm also calculating and actually arguing what is the lifetime benefit of the euro, and I'm basically arguing it's about 10,000 euro per capita, half of it being explained by this reserve asset position. We can then maybe debate whether it's 0.4 or 0.6 from the reserve position, depending, of course, on the market share of the euro. To express this very simply, we Europeans in the euro area, we can import, we can have a deficit, a current account deficit of 0.5% of GDP and not pay for it in real terms. We just give our new euros for that. So here we would have, of course, the same privilege as the United States, assuming that the euro is a stable currency. We have a world-class banking system, and we have low inflation rates, because otherwise we would not be a reserve currency. Okay, so we have now these financial market instability problems in the US. I'm not fully convinced that these problems are solved. And we have the euro crisis, and I would like to emphasize at this point that at least when I was writing a book on the transatlantic banking crisis, when I was finishing the manuscript in October 2008, 6 months after Lehman Brothers, my conclusions on 2 pages was there will be a euro crisis, because I did not anticipate Ireland, I should say, but my view basically was that if the risk premiums were initially too low, then of course they will now rise very much, and risk appetite is falling strongly. So then all the countries which have high debt GDP ratios or very high deficit ratios should very much change their fiscal policies, and if in the case of Greece you just do the opposite, of course you are in serious trouble. Okay, the situation at present is, okay, we have the EU, we have a Euro club. There's an enormous frustration, I would say, on the side of the citizens. You might also ask the Queen of England. As you know, when she visited the London School of Economics, she would ask the economists, why did nobody tell us that there would be this banking crisis? And 2 colleagues wrote a letter. I will not comment on this, but I think, we economists, I think we have lost considerable impact in the political sphere because so few people did anticipate the important things. It's not that each individual, as an economist, of course, should anticipate this, but the profession as such, I think, did not really deliver. You can, of course, say that Ryan wrote a wonderful paper for the Jackson Hole Conference in 2005, but nobody wanted to listen to him. But I think there's a deeper problem. Now, in the EU, we have a free rider problem, and I think we have political moral hazard in a different sense than was mentioned in the morning. We have this problem that the reputation of this club, of the Euro area or the EU, seen from Washington or from Beijing, I mean, that's an international public good, so to speak, and some small countries don't care, and the Commission doesn't organize, and so on and so on. So the biggest challenge in a nutshell is this Greek deficit fraud. So they announced 4% to the Commission, and the true value is 15.6%, and this is a political deficit fraud, and as we know, Greece was effectively bailed out. But I mean, what is the solution? The solution is not the fiscal compact. The fiscal compact, if there is a major problem, a similar problem, nobody will take the country to the court, because there would have to be 3 countries at the same time which would have to take the country to the court, and who should believe that this is going to happen? This is not very convincing. Now, one practical measure, of course, could be, and practical measures are important. It's not often so important that you invest a lot of money. You should think twice, what type of institutional change should we have here? And I think we need much more transparency. It's not so difficult. I mean, it's politically difficult to find agreement, but I think you should have, of course, the same software in every Minister of Finance in the European Union, allow the Commission to look into the computer real time, of course not to make any changes. I would not be against maybe even allowing every citizen to look into this budget computer. Of course, parliaments decide, but we want to look what is happening. It is a disaster if the Commission understands only 6 months or a year later what is happening in Athens. If you are the boss of a big company and you understand only 6 months later what is happening with your controllers and with your balance sheets, I think, of course, you're also in trouble. Then I think there's a kind of a mystery. Probably some of you will know that there is an IMF report of 2010 which says that Greece has assets of more than 350 billion euro, so government assets. They have privatized so far 3 billion. I mean, this is ridiculous. Who would believe that a European Union, which is so proud to say, oh, we have this variety of experience, we have all the experience with difficult privatization in Eastern Europe, and we are unable to call on this experience. And when I was suggesting to the German government that they should involve the EBRD, which I had suggested 2 years ago, they said, well, we cannot do this because Greece is not part of Eastern Europe. I think this is not very practical. Americans would say, okay, let's get all the Greek people, all the Greek experts in London and many other experts and make them work. Okay, one other aspect which has nothing to do with this crisis, but I think which nevertheless should be taken serious. We are spending a lot of money, I'm just looking here at France and Germany, on things which have enormous implications in terms of the debt-GDP ratio. If I understand correctly, in France we have a minimum wage which basically goes along with public wage subsidies, which amount to 1% of GDP. Now, if this is a 1% deficit GDP ratio stemming from wage subsidies, you would get, based on an expected trend growth rate of 1.5% for France, you would just get 66.7% of an equilibrium debt GDP ratio just from this wage subsidy. Well, we cannot afford this, so we have to find better ways. In Germany, with this wonderful Energiewende, with its energy turnaround, I mean, this is unbelievable that this happens in reality. It's unbelievable in the sense that we are roughly spending 1% of GDP, not directly as subsidies, so it's the users of electricity, many households who are paying it, and there's no innovation effect. The EFI Commission, an expert commission of the Chancellor, just has pointed out. And again, okay, in Germany we have a balanced budget, mainly due to this, to these safe haven effects. But if it would not be for that, we would then have a 1% deficit GDP ratio just because of a mismanaged Energiewende. So facing the challenges from the US, from China, and maybe some other countries, I think the Europeans should look at the national and supranational level twice and think what is really important. When it comes to incentives, I would like to repeat a proposal which I have made a couple of years ago, namely in the banking sector and stability there. I think one should impose a tax on the variance of the rate of return on equity, because what you want is not more regulation, and because the banks always will be more clever and faster and rather head for the next disaster if it is profitable at least for a few years. Instead, you want to give an incentive that they think very hard what is a realistic long-term rate of return on equity. And financial markets, I can only repeat, I mean, this is a wildcat innovation scenery. This is so unbelievable. I mean, in the 1880s here in Düsseldorf and in the Ruhr area, you could see boilers explode, industrial boilers explode, people dying, workers being hurt, and so on. And then they introduce all these standardization bodies. In financial markets, I mean, it's not a big thing to introduce a standardization body. It can be created by the banks themselves, maybe. But we don't have these. I mean, most bonds, most papers given as collateral to the ECB don't have a market price. This is some wild innovation. Maybe this is very intelligent, and maybe experts could tell us, but we just don't know. And I think we should not accept this. And the problem is that in the long term, the ratio of financial wealth to income is increasing all the time. So we are an accumulating society, and looking at also recent book of Piketty, I think we can find additional evidence. So here we have a big problem. I don't want to go into this, but I would like to emphasize now this political economy, political union issue. So the question is, can we continue on the basis of old institutions? Can we just go back and have a reset, okay, a better stability and growth back? Or do we need a new institutional setup? Which one? What are the cost benefits? And so on. Now the EU, is it an effective and efficient policy actor? We have as task in Brussels agriculture, structural funds, trade policy, competition policy, control of national subsidization. The size of the budget is 1% of GDP. What is the comparable number for the US? So that is federal government expenditures without Social Security. It's 11%. So, I mean, it's clear that 1% cannot work. I mean, this is nothing for fiscal policy. This is, of course, impossible to have a counter-cyclical policy in Brussels based on 1% of GDP. Maybe it was nice in the beginning, and we are just continuing this like as if the world would not have changed. You can look at the structure of revenue, of course, tariffs and its member countries' grants, and I would say the EU is rather inefficient for the moment. So we as economists, what would we look at which textbook, at which theoretical starting point when we would ask how much money should be spent in Brussels, how much money should be spent in Paris or Berlin, and how much money in Düsseldorf and so on. You look at the theory of fiscal federalism, and I will be very brief for this analytical point of reference. Basically, from a US perspective, we would say, okay, central government will have defense expenditure, income redistribution, because you can do this only at a federal level. There's a grant program for the states, which should reflect the size of the respective spillovers. Some central taxation, of course, is necessary, and the question is, okay, can we take the US as an example or compare it to the EU? And local expenditures would reflect voters' preferences. The tax price should reflect local benefits. Just one word on grants. If Germany has high government R&D subsidies, and this generates a lot of innovations and a lot of innovation spillovers for other EU countries, then fiscal federalism suggests then Brussels should give Germany some money to reflect, of course, this positive externality. Otherwise, you get in this EU single market an underinvestment in R&D, and then you have a problem with total factor productivity growth. Okay, on the other hand, let's not be naive. We know, of course, taking a look at the literature, certain things are not so easy to get. So when I say wonderful supranational redistribution, okay, let's look at the paper of Feldstein and Weyand-Vrobel. They publish empirical evidence that suggests that state government attempts to redistribute income are not successful due to the high labor mobility in the US. However, we could say in the EU, labor mobility, of course, is a little bit smaller. So we could have national redistribution, income redistribution. On the other hand, if you take a look again at the figures, I mean, things happen which, let's say, are just surprising. There's a study by our colleagues from the Cologne Institut der Deutschen Wirtschaft, from Mrs. Nihus. She shows that in France, Bulgaria, and Cyprus, the post-tax income position of the top quintile was better than before taxes in 2009. What type of income redistribution is that? I mean, can we really be so inefficient? Do we want this? Do we think that this is a benchmark, and then we have open coordination and maybe some other country thinks, okay, let's follow this? Next point, as you all know, of course, Canada and the US have federal anti-cyclical fiscal policy which dampens the business cycle. I would at least assume, and our colleagues from the IMF, Ayad et al., they have just estimated that a 1% negative shock to the national GDP reduces in the US consumption by 0.2%, but in the euro area by 0.6%. So the euro area has, of course, a rather poor policy mix compared to the US, and anti-cyclical policy will be super complex for a group of 18 euro countries. So in this institutional setup, I think this is not very good. Of course, in the US, not everything is rosy. You can look at the economic report of the president a year ago, and you will find that, for instance, the US states' fiscal policy is found to be largely pro-cyclical. So maybe we have certain problems here, but the current structure doesn't make any sense. Okay, so the euro crisis has shifted the balance of power in the EU in favor of the European summit. Now, this is a tragedy because it revives nationalism. I mean, the idea that we have a European Commission which would tell maybe the Greek government, okay, you have a serious debt problems, you have to do this and this and this, and then the government or the people in Athens will not be mad vis-a-vis Mrs. Merkel, but vis-a-vis the Commission, and the same Commission would tell the Germans that your Energiewende, your energy U-turn, is not compatible, and it is not compatible with the EU single market. So I think we are heading just in the wrong direction. Now, restoring trust and political support requires, I think, to refocus policy activities and certainly to avoid the stupid type of activities which nobody needs, so this oil carafe regulation. On the other hand, I do not accept the argument saying, oh, we have this principle of subsidiarity, which says we don't want that things are done in Brussels, which could be also done equally well at the level of the member countries. I mean, this is a very static view of everything. The benchmark here is what is the voter turnout at the next European election. As you know, the voter turnout has kept falling year by year or election by election at the European level. This means weak competition, highly inefficient economic policy and other policies we should expect. If in Brussels there would be much more money on the table and real power, so not about oil carafes, then you would see much higher turnout at the voter ballot. You would see strong political competition, political efficiency gains, and in this type of Schumpeterian dynamic view, I think you get a different view of subsidiarity. Okay, so let's go back to this Greek deficit fraud. It happened in an election year 2009. The Greek government was trying to buy an election victory on credit, and it didn't work. Now, how can we avoid this? So questions basically are, how can we improve vertical fiscal policy and policy mix, and never have, again, to face any problem like this Greek deficit fraud. In Berlin, they think the fiscal compact will do it. Fiscal compact will not work. And find a sequence, I would say, how to move to a political union. Okay, so I'm dealing with these two or three things in parallel in a certain way. So you want to avoid this free rider attitude and avoid political moral hazard behavior, and make sure that we get a better policy mix in the future. So I think it's really important to think what is the minimum budget we need in Brussels. I think it's roughly about 6% of GDP, including expenditure for the first 6 months of unemployment. And you would spend the money mainly on infrastructure, on defense, higher R&D expenditures, and of course some traditional EU expenditures. Would you shift also some traditional expenditures back home? Why not? So the United States, as I told you, has 11% in Washington. If you disregard social expenditure, we would need, the minimum I think is 6%, so 1.5% for infrastructure, 1.5% for defense, and so on. Now, what has this then also to do with the Greek deficit fraud problem of 2009? If you had such a new reallocation of government expenditures, and we had another Greek-type case, the answer then, of course, is what will happen to the country? The country will go bankrupt. And it is not a disaster and not a contagion problem as we did have it with Greece in 2010, because there still would be highways built in Greece, unemployment compensation is paid, and government is not collapsing. So, on the other hand, it's also clear there's something missing. I mean, why would the boss of a Greek government really engage in this moral hazard trick which he tried in 2009? Of course, he would never do this if the natural top goal of his political career would be, I want to be a member of the future government in Brussels, or I want to be the boss of this government. In Europe, so far, we don't have truly European parties. We don't have European parties. Many conflicts which you have in the United States, between states, they are sorted out in the political party of the Republicans or the Democrats. It doesn't come up as a big thing between California and New Mexico or other neighboring states, although this, of course, can happen. So if politicians would know, first, there is this credible threat. If I try Greek 2009 deficit, I will go bankrupt. And if they also have this positive incentive, okay, I want to pursue my career up to the level of Brussels, then of course you get a different behavior. This will work. These incentives can work while the fiscal compact cannot work. Okay, of course, the implication is in a certain way then obvious. We would need a European Parliament which would elect a supranational government, which would impose Euro taxation. But the nice thing is that the total income tax ratio, of course, could be below the current ratio. Why? I mean, ask the McKinsey people. What did they calculate? That if you have a big defense budget in Brussels, you will save a lot of money. Of course, you will save a lot of money. We can reduce income taxes after that. And of course, we would have Eurobonds. Now, you know that at present we have this philosophy that national government should not make more than a structural deficit GDP ratio of 0.5%. I think we need a different arrangement. Look at the DOMA formula, and then I think the good idea would be to have a structural deficit maximum of 0.5% in Brussels and 0.25% at the national level. This would imply, as a long-term debt GDP ratio, 50%. So this is something which would work. I think in addition to this, of course, you have to focus on economic growth. And in this respect, I would like to emphasize that information communication technology is very much underestimated. If you look at the ICT investment GDP ratio in nominal terms, you would find what many politicians tell you, oh, this sector is becoming increasingly less important because this ratio is falling since 2005 in the US and Germany and some other countries. If you look at this ratio in real terms, it is increasing all the time. If you look at the share of ICT investment in real terms, in total investment, in Australia, in the US, and you take as a base year 1990, the share is close to 80%. So I think the Commission was on the right track in putting up this Lisbon agenda emphasizing ICT, but I mean the Lisbon agenda in the end did not really deliver. And where did it, or where was it failing most? If you take a look at ICT patents per capita, the weakest countries were Portugal and Greece. After 1995, you see in all these countries of the EU a strong increase in ICT patenting per capita. You don't see it in these two countries. Okay, so ICT and also integrated energy markets, I think, could be quite important. As you know, in Washington, there's no innovation ministry. R&D money is spent on defense, on the defense budget and on the energy budget. Now, if you take a look at, for instance, the price ratio of Germany to the US in the field of electricity prices for industry, most recent figure here is 2.22. So electricity prices in Germany are more than 2 times as high as in the US. In the appendix of the paper, I've taken a look at the variance of electricity prices in US states and EU member countries, and it's smaller in the US. So of course, I think also in the US you have certain problems and there are some regional conditions, but we can get much more competition, enormous efficiency gains. You might have as a transition problem, as we have it in Germany now. I'm not sure whether Mr. Röger has this in his analysis, but of course, if you are switching to renewables, you might have to write down a big part of your capital stock in the energy sector. And the energy stock, of course, is very big. If you think of all the nuclear energy, for instance, in Germany, and many coal and gas-powered stations. Okay, how different are EU countries? This is still a very interesting question. I was just looking here at the difference in social stress based on the strikes and lockouts, so rates of days not worked per 1,000 employees. By that token, France is under strong pressure, looking at the ranking for 2006. Italy, not so much. No problem at all for a country which is not a member country of the EU, namely Switzerland. And strangely, ILO doesn't give for many EU countries any data. Last point, issue of Eurobonds. So any monetary union is absolutely incomplete without a banking union and Eurobonds. So we get the banking union. Now the launching of supranational Eurobonds, I think, should be and must be in an exclusive maturity range, not of 6 months, no, 10 years. You need long-term bonds. Who is going to believe that the Euro area economic and monetary union is to be a long-term venture if you start with 6 months? No, you need long-term bonds. And this is, of course, where you get the big institutional investors if you can convince them. I'm very much in favor that governments would be allowed to exchange up to 20% of GDP of national bonds into Euro bonds. On the other hand, they can also exchange bonds if they bring government assets to a separate EU institution, or maybe to the European, to the ESM or some other institution. So introducing Eurobonds can mean very different things. And of course it would mean something, I'm not sure whether this is convincing from a legal perspective, but if Italy and Germany would say, okay, we want to issue based on a common treaty, we want to issue joint bonds, which have government assets, so highways, electricity grids as collateral. This is something totally different than saying, okay, we just want to have Eurobonds. What is most important also is here that, of course, if banks could exchange in their balance sheet national Eurobonds to some extent by these supranational bonds, they immediately have, of course, perfect risk diversification, almost perfect risk diversification, which means they will pay the lower price for raising capital. They will give more loans, you will get more investment, you get growth, jobs, tax revenues, and just things which we need. And final point, of course, it might be necessary to consider the option of true quantitative easing. How will you want to do this if you don't have Eurobonds? You can start a thing, say, okay, I buy bonds of all countries. What a nonsense is that? This is nothing what the financial markets in the end, and also later when you get out of QE, could really want and use. A few points at the end. Who can issue Eurobonds?
How long are you planning to talk?
No, you will have to tell me, I can make 2 more minutes.
Considering that we do not have a discussion, as I know you have more time than others have. Okay. But 2 minutes is okay. Okay, so I just wrap up. So several institutions could actually place such Eurobonds, and we could have type 1 and type 2. Type 2 is where everybody's talking about. Basically, everybody on the basis of the current share, if you want, in the ECB. But we can have type 1. So you can have 60% German and French bonds and 0% Greek bonds, or maybe 0.005% Greek bonds. You must, of course, come to the financial market and offer a financial instrument which beats the benchmark, which is at least as good as a US bond of the same maturity. I think type 2 will not do it. Okay, so to sum up, I think it's not too difficult to solve this problem, but you have to solve it in a certain way radically. The alternative is, if you do not want to introduce these 4 elements,
you wait until the next big crisis comes, and then you do everything under chaotic circumstances, and that, of course, will not really work. Okay, so I think it is economically rational to consider a Euro political union as solving the current problems in a long-term way. I think the alternatives, just continuing in a kind of new stability and growth pact, fiscal compact, is not convincing. In this respect, I'm also very much, of course, not on the same line as Mr. Zinn. I think it is the task of the economist to carefully look into the alternatives which policymakers have, try to quantify what the alternatives are, and then in the end, of course, the voters will decide. In the end, my message, of course, is this. Thank you.